Liz, thank you for joining me today. Super pumped to have you on. You guys, welcome back to the Self-Selecting Podcast. Today, I'm joined by none other than Liz Brody. You've seen me post her on my Instagram. If you follow her, you know it is content and it is value-adding content, which, like we were just talking about, like that's hardly ever the case on Instagram. There's a lot of traps and things that, look good, but don't necessarily teach, educate, and frankly, just don't make a lot of sense. But I guess first I want to start off for listeners who aren't familiar with you, with what you do. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so thank you for the intro. I'm really excited to be on the podcast here. My name is Liz Brody. I am Liz Brody Fitness on Instagram, and I have been in the personal training and gym space for over a decade at this point. I started going a little bit hybrid with online coaching, and then, 2020 came around and I went full blown online coaching, but my passion is very much so still in training. I love nutrition as well, but training is really like my passion. And I do my best with my platform and with, of course, my one-on-one clients to help to spread the knowledge that I wish I had earlier in my training career. Because I think, like many other people, I was doing a whole lot of nonsense for I had a really fun time doing it, but I know I would have gotten such better results had I had better guidance, a better mentor. So that's really my object, my mission, especially with women. Like, I really want us to just cut the bullshit, stop doing all the silly things that might get lots of clicks on the internet, and just learn how to train properly.
I can say, like, now, dating Jordan Genta, like, and being under his guise as far as like really being taken through like the principles of like hypertrophy and really training and just biomechanics. It's something that now I've realized I'm like, man, like there is so much that I was doing wrong. And it's not to say that like you can't get progress doing things incorrectly, but especially for someone like yourself, like myself, who's like, hey, like I'm in it. I want to see like notable changes the next time I'm on stage or even just season to season. It's like, I don't know, suboptimal progress, as even like as a natural athlete or somewhat natural athlete, like that's not good enough. And especially in today's sport, like in bodybuilding, it's like you see girls who are very, very adamant that they're willing to do whatever it takes. And some of that progress is happening very quickly. So no viewers think I'm natural at this point. I hope that's very clear. But even then, like the approach I take still does require a lot of proficiency and intention in training. And I love that yourself, like you put out so much information just around these principles, but also like identifying an application, like here's probably how you're doing it or how you've been taught how to do it. Let's just get this straight. Let's clear this up. You do such a good job and it's such a value add online.
Thank you. I mean, I do try to make it as digestible as possible. Just a message to anybody who might be listening to this. You guys don't know me, but if you like it, I love it. That's something that I say a lot when it comes to people's training. So even if we talk about something during this discussion and you're all like, oh, but I like that exercise, like, okay. But also, if you are competitive or if you just really want to see certain changes in your physique, objectivity is ultimately going to be your best friend. And that's the only reason why I was able to finally see the changes in my own physique and be able to better help my clients, is because I was able to remove the emotion that I might have had attached to certain types of training. And just like you mentioned, through just learning from Jordan, like I also went through Prescript curriculum, which Jordan is co-founder of. So like you learn biomechanics, it's physics, like this stuff, joint positions, it's just true. And when you're able to apply that with your own body, it's like, wow, I was creating a lot of unnecessary chaos in my training.
Yeah, I think what I enjoy the most about it, I mean, like learning it through this domain realistically, because its own domain in fitness, is that you can really fact check all of this. Like it's not a lot of the principles are not really open to interpretation in that sense. Like, I mean, they're verified and they're not things that are really like things you can argue against. And sure, when you talk about application or even design, it's like you can do things differently and you can do things that go against the grain. But realistically, I think where a lot of people make mistakes is that they don't have that intention. They don't know why they're doing something. It's more so I'm just following the pack. I'm just doing what I saw this girl who I think looks great, and she does look great. I saw her doing this, so I thought that's what I needed to do. And I think for me, it created a lot of autonomy and agency within training, even around decision making, just to have that foundation. So I'm excited to get into this with you. And I think really where this conversation kind of starts is, for listeners who don't know, I mean, like you did something that I think is like incredibly challenging. And far and few people can do it. And that's, you prepped yourself for your bodybuilding show this year. You were very transparent about it. And now you're in a position where you're building and like, hey, I got mass to put on, and like, I'm going about it in a way that makes sense. But I guess really the question I want to pitch to you is like, how much of a focus is training, knowing that hypertrophy is the goal? Like you got to build the density to be competitive and to make progress your next show.
Yeah, so I will say for me, training is my love. I always talk about this. If there's anywhere I'd want to be, it's the gym. So for me, that part has never been hard for me. In fact, I was one of those people that would be in the gym and just doing way too much, and there was an absence of quality. And like you mentioned, if you don't really understand why you're doing something, it's harder to actually nail down what the best plan might be for you. So for me, I did prep myself. I have actually been engaging in bodybuilding for a really long time, but the inception of the bikini division, let's say like 2009, 2010, it was so different. So now there's been this shift, which I love, right, towards so much more muscularity. And I always considered myself to be kind of a more muscular girl, right? Just a little bit sturdy, like more muscular. But this process of prepping myself and truly getting into stage condition, which I had never done before, I was like, wait, I'm not that big. Like, I was so stunned when, like, my main judging feedback was just to grow, and one of the judges even mentioned quads, which never in a million years did I think I'd have somebody tell me I need to build my quads, because they've just always been there, right? I was a dancer my whole life. I got quads. But, yeah, so I happen to love hypertrophy training. I don't wanna do CrossFit. I don't wanna power lift. I like to lock in and focus. So for me, it goes very much so, it meshes very well. I don't find it boring because I love refining the skill of each movement.
Yeah. And I think that's like such a good segue into really the core of this conversation is for hypertrophy goals, because that's largely the listeners who are here. Maybe there's some performance listeners, but largely it's going to be individuals who are like, whether on stage or off stage, maybe they have no aspirations to compete, but they're like, I want to emulate a very similar physique to what I see these top athletes have. I want to be curvy at a lower body fat. I want to have shape, and I don't want to lose it when I have abs. And I think that's, very much representative of what the bikini division is kind of becoming, even to some extent, even very extreme leanness, but also an extreme muscularity, which is kind of cool. Cause I also share that sentiment that like in 2015, like I was told don't grow your quads. Like I was 19 years old and they're like, bring your glutes up, a little more shape, don't touch your quads. I'm like, I'm 19. Like I just got hot dogs I'm walking around on. Like there's not much muscle. And even to this day, I'm like, you know what? A little more quad actually might, and especially if that results in more glute, that might actually benefit me. So I guess the direction I want to go with this is, you know, setting intentions for yourself, for myself, for clients. It does start with the division, right? Like what are the needs of the athlete? Where do we need that muscle? So can you walk me through your thought process with, maybe we start even at like training split in like how often we're going to be hitting these body parts and we can go region by region, but that kind of process for you, what does that look like?
Yeah, so for me or for anybody who's listening to this, especially if you're more of a beginner competitor, because by all means, I am a coach first, competitor second. Like I am not out here competing nationally or anything, right? But being able to either look at your physique honestly on your own or getting good objective feedback from a coach to see what actually needs to grow the most, because a lot of people got to grow everything. Even if you only want to compete in fit model at this point, fit model is brand new. I'm looking at these pictures of the girls and like, you can't go do well in on a fit model stage only training your glutes. Your shoulders, your arms need a little bit of something. if you don't naturally have the hourglass shape, you're probably going to need to build some lat width. So ultimately, being able to understand what your base is for essentially women's divisions across the board, I think most of us have to work on our glutes pretty hard as a focal point based on the level of muscularity that is necessary to get those tie-ins or requisite type of definition for your division. And once you understand the priorities for your own physique, you can start to draw up a training split. And the split in itself is never going to be the magic. It's going to be how you're allocating training volume to each movement pattern or to each muscle group within your split. If you're doing upper lower, but your upper days are basically delts and back, then that's very different than doing upper lower, but doing everything, chest, triceps, biceps, back, everything, so it really doesn't matter quite so much on like what the split is per se. Rather, map it out. What on your physique needs work? How are you going to recover between these sessions? How many days per week are you realistically going to be training? And you can go from there. I think a lot of people, they're looking for the magic split. They're looking at the wellness girls and they're looking at the bikini girls. Oh, she does 3 days a week glutes. She does 4. And it's like, well, stop getting distracted by what they do. And like, let's look at your body and what you need.
I love this. And, it's just, I get really excited, I think now having a better understanding of training and how to approach it, even discussing it with you. So it's really cool because I think a lot of times like people will kind of pigeonhole themselves into, well, this girl does 4 days a week. God, dude, there's a girl I follow. She's just turned pro and she does 5 days a week of glutes. And I have a client who's like, I should do that, right? Like, because my glutes are really lagging. I'm like, we're missing a lot of context. And like, the thing that I know is important to both of us, and like we kind of discussed before we got on, is like really making sure that like the tone in which we're talking about it is still respectful, but also encompassing that like, hey, like there could be a reason that someone is doing something that we're saying don't do or probably isn't ideal. But realistically, that's not likely the best way, or unless there's a very specific context, it probably doesn't apply to said listener. And that's where I almost look at it like I've had clients who, yes, like they have good glutes, but we still need a little bit more. But even more than glutes, we need upper body because clavicularly they're not very wide and they've got a really long torso. So just overall to create that balance and to create a maturity in their physique, yeah, they need the glutes. They still need the tie-ins, like, but largely if we don't get that upper body up to par with the lower body, we're not really going to bring that shape. We're still going to look very wispy. And I think that's where like individual structure is huge. If you have shorter tie-ins, like the amount of muscle per square inch you need to get the same depth and projection as someone with really long tie-ins is probably going to be different. And you might get away with building technically less pounds on your frame, but we also have to figure out how to balance that relative to your quad growth, relative to the actual detail in your hamstring. And then that's where you even look at like body fat predisposition is if you were, let's say, someone who stores fat very evenly, how does this actually translate to your prep? And is it something that we almost want to preemptively overcompensate because we know the tines, or if it's someone who stores fat, let's say at the tie-in, at the quad, at the hips, if that's the case, well, we need to make sure that's not the least muscular part of your frame, because that's also going to work against you once we're at that point in prep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one big message, especially for I'm natural, right? Like nobody cares, Liz, but just to give a disclaimer in case anybody thinks, oh, you can't get tigers when you're natural, you can't get that lean, da da da. We need so much more muscle than we might realize. And when you're in a building phase and you have extra body fat, there might look like you have more quads than you really do. You might think you have more glutes than you really do. The second you start getting really lean, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, where did all that tissue go? It might not have been muscle tissue. So, speaking of like my own prep, right? The build leading up to that, I was like, I need as much muscle as possible. Like, I know that once I start dieting down, my quads aren't this big, right? And then you start getting leaner and leaner. And then you're like, yeah, after this prep, I'm going to need a big building phase again, right? But it's just part of the process. And I think people have this misconception in their head that bikini isn't that big, but it is at this point in time to get that, like you were mentioning, having shorter tie-ins, maybe you store more body fat there too, to get the glutes to actually show themselves on stage. It's not just about being lean enough. It's about having the muscle that also pops through that skin there. And that's like one of the hugest things. And I can't drive that point home enough. It's like you probably need more muscle before you even draw up a prep timeline for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's incredibly rare to have someone who accidentally is on the cusp of too big. And even then, like I almost pose the challenge. I'm like, if you've never competed before, let's make sure that you actually like this before you make that commitment. Especially in the case that someone is wanting to do one of the other divisions like wellness or figure, we really have to consider like you can, like they're not going to kick you off stage if you're natural. But I'm also saying that like there's a lot of amateur competitors where the drug use is very heavy. You're allowed to compete, but if the goal is to win, we really have to be realistic around what your personal goals are, whether that is to place subjectively better than your competitors, whether you're willing to make that commitment, but then also like even just fundamentally, like, do you have the fortitude and do you enjoy getting as lean as you need to? Is that a fun process that you want to repeat? Because I just had this conversation this weekend with a former client who's like, my, trainer says I should do figure. And I'm like, honey, like I am too small for bikini. Okay. Like, and that's with TRT, that's with GH. Like I've used drugs, but like realistically, there is a level of commitment that I think a lot of people, they underestimate, even from a size wise, but then also decision making down the line. If it's something you're trying to take all the way, drugs aside, it just could be a slower process, but it does at the crux of it. Like I do agree wholeheartedly is like, we can solve a lot of problems preemptively by building enough muscle. And if we can do that, like you're going to be in a much better position to have a ton of mobility with whatever you decide you want to do.
Yeah, 100%. And at the end of the day, it is bodybuilding. If you, I'm sure lots of competitors have seen it themselves or people who just engage in bodybuilding recreationally, they get pretty lean, but all of a sudden it's like, wait, there's nothing that looks like a tie in here. Like, where is that? And like, you might have really lean abs, lean arms, because a lot of us women, we lean out a lot easier on the top. It's like you just need that muscle tissue there. Like I train at Elevation Fitness, and there's a ton of bodybuilder girlies in there, lots of also Latin women who are just really jacked on the bottom. And even when they're kind of like at off-season body fat levels, you can see tie-ins through their leggings. And that kind of did something in my brain. I was like, that's muscle density, like that. And that ultimately, like when you're 15, 20 pounds above stage weight and you see some shape at the bottom of your glute, that's muscle. Like that's ultimately what we need to be chasing for those of us competitors and those of us women who just we don't have the muscle to begin with, like we need to be building just like a bodybuilder.
I I couldn't agree more. And I think like the mindset shift really around like, okay, I'm in this build. What's the expectation? I think a lot of people go into it thinking that like I'm going to outbuild my body fat and somehow get leaner while adding this muscle. And I think for a lot of individuals, it's so misguided because for me, like I almost look at it like we're looking for weight going up, strength going up. If we can get strength to go up, weight to go up, and we can get measurements to go up in the right areas, yes, some fat will come on, but realistically, we're just looking for the physique to not look worse. We're just looking for you to not look softer and for the waistline to not consistently and exponentially get bigger while the areas that we want to grow are growing and in terms of circumference. And I know for a lot of people, they stress, they're like, well, what's a good rate of change in a build? Like, what can we expect? And I'm like, it really, like, largely I see the strongest correlation with strength progressions, or even just having sessions where it's like, I know that I worked hard today. Like, I know I couldn't have done any more. And I think like focusing in on that, I know for me, this past build, that made an incredible difference. Like I was very convinced last year. I was like, I'm probably going to have to use drugs in the off season, which I have yet to do. And I'm like, if I need to do it, I will, but let me just try it last hurrah at, training correctly and training in a state where I can grow. And it shocked me how like if that is your North Star, that can actually result in a lot of progress in seemingly individuals like myself who like been training for a while. Like you aren't really near newbie gains. So I would love to hear more about this build. What you've done in terms of like you got off stage, you knew, okay, I needed to grow. Obviously, the tie-ins were the area. Let's focus in on this. What did that look like in terms of training design for you?
So one thing that you've talked about in the past, which I think is really important to, for, I'm such a podcast listener. I think I've listened to every episode. So is understanding that just because we're talking about hypertrophy and competing in bodybuilding doesn't mean that we are not focused on performance. In fact, training performance is one of the best metrics, like you just said, that we can use during a building phase. Because even if you're not, if your body fat levels are under control in your build and you didn't have a bad post show rebound, the presence of body fat hides muscularity. Even if you are still relatively lean, you can't see as much of it as you can when you're prepping for a show. So it's like, well, what can we look at? We can look at training performance. Like, for example, people know me for my RDLs, right? Because when do you see a little bikini girl doing RDLs with 100-pound dumbbells, like with really good form, right? That was one of the first exercises that I just kind of was like, you know what? I like that movement. I feel it pretty well. I'm going to try to run it up. And even now in this current build that I'm in, that's one of my primary exercises. Do I get a little hamstring from that as well? Of course I do. But I try to use very, glute biased form. I use the dumbbell, so it's close to my center of mass. Low back is a little bit, it's a little bit more low back friendly because the dumbbells are so close to your body. RDLs, split squats, all of these leg presses, even because I got a green light to train my quads, right? So all these movements that actually make your glutes stretch around the pelvis, because all the focus on the short position, everything, we leave so much on the table. And I think with a lot of bikini competitors, they're like, oh, well, I only need upper outer glute. And it's like, hey, well, maybe a judge told you that, but ultimately part of the upper is it's still your glute max. So it's like more glute max overall is going to make your glute pop out more. And sure, do the abductions, do the cable kickbacks. Nobody is saying not to. But for me, you asked me about my build. So I'm looking at my big movements. I'm looking at my RDLs. I'm looking at my Bulgarian split squat with a contralateral load. I'm looking at my leg presses that I focus mostly on hip flexion, more like a 90-degree angle at the knee. And then at my gym, we have this freaking amazing hip thrust machine. It's by the Glute Builder, and it's kind of like it looks like a Smith machine, but a baby version. So having that, yeah, hip thrusts are 100% like back in. It's great because I have a great setup. But like basically those four things, that's my main stuff. And I really aim to progress at those things, whether it's skill, whether it's an extra rep on a working set, and over time scaling up the loads in order to build the glutes to get the tie-ins that I want.
I think you touched on something so important with each of those is picking movements that one, you can emphasize more so mid-range to lengthened, but also movements that you can consistently overload. And
Yeah.
I think that largely is an issue where individuals, they even those listening to this who are like, hey, I understand progressive overload, but I get it as a concept, but actually putting it in place, what does that look like, especially when things aren't linear? And that's something I think is a little bit more of an advanced skill set to develop, to know and to be able to make decisions around, like when you're not at 100%, or if it's your leg C day, which I kind of just like categorize as like, I know my Monday and my Friday, I do lower 3 days a week. Monday and Friday are my send it days. Like I want to feel fucked up the next day. Like I want to feel like I need an off day, or I need a day that is not as systemically fatiguing. I still have that third day in the middle on Wednesday, but realistically, I'm organizing it in a way where the emphasis isn't so much on pelvic stability. Like I'm not doing something that is going to be so taxing that I'm then fucked up on Friday. I'm doing movements that I can still load, but realistically, the intention there is still to get in the volume, but to also kind of prep for that Friday session. And I think even like within the scope of like a 3 lower split, it's still like I found it beneficial to kind of go into each session and be like, okay, let me use the warm-ups, let me look at my stability, see where I'm at today. Even Monday, I take Saturday, Sunday off. Like I'm like, these are my rest days. And Monday, there's no reason I should have been under recovered, but I was. And maybe it was because we are out in the sun. Maybe it was because sleep's a little weird. I don't know. Someone said something about an astrology thing that like everyone feels like shit this week. So like I went in, warm-ups were not warming up. Like snatches were terrible. And I was like, it's going to be a lighter day. Like I need to auto regulate for this because I'm not going to be able to be productive. Like I can probably benefit actually from scaling back today, maybe focusing on movements where I don't have to brace nearly as much. And then the next time I come in, I can try to send it if it makes sense with the training split. But I think like having that awareness around movements that consistently you have that mobility, you can decide like, can I load this? And to what degree should I load this? Should I go up in weight? Should I add more reps? Hey, I noticed last week I wasn't as stable as I wanted to be, but it was a PR. So this week I'm going to kind of handicap it at that point rather than just progress up load.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just touched on something is like that pelvic stability. Some days you might be feeling great, but for whatever reason, your brain isn't really connecting very well with your body. And it's like, if you have trouble stabilizing your pelvis, it's like, okay, well, maybe we need a hand support for split squats today, or maybe I need to take it over to the leg press instead of using this squat machine. And sometimes understanding that it's okay and actually advantageous to make decisions like that on the fly, or it could even be load selection. I know you're big on the B stance RDL. I give B stance RDLs to lots of clients. When that dumbbell starts getting heavy, it also starts getting really big. And sometimes it's just clunky. And it's like, okay, maybe instead of this 90-pound dumbbell that's actually just cumbersome and like getting in the way, maybe I need to go down to the 70 and do better work, and making
Yeah.
decisions like that for yourself. And of course, a coach can help you with things like this, but taking some autonomy within your training and understanding that just because you have one off day doesn't mean you're going to go change your whole program, but also understanding that you're in the gym to do good work. And if that means slightly reducing load and maybe adding a working set to make up for the volume, that might be a better idea on that given day. But like, don't lose the plot. Don't go say, oh, my mind muscle connection is bad today, so I'm just going to spam cable kickbacks. Like, that's also not a good idea.
I so really the thing with B stance RDL, I'm just jealous of Jordan. I'm just trying to keep up with him and I'm just trying to impress him, honestly. But no, that was one actually like primary movement largely to help identify that like, hey, I'm lacking pelvic stability. I have organs, like they're fake abs. Like it's just a lack of body fat up here, but like literally it's just psoas holding me together, as most of us. And like when I started doing those was like, these are hard, even though bilateral RDL, like technically I should be able to lift more than this, but this kind of movement, okay, this is self-imposing this handicap. And I almost see that as like runway. And I think you're absolutely right. There's a point where it just becomes pretty impractical with a lot of movements. And I think that's where we vibed on this like 2 years ago with the hex bar RDLs. I was like, I think it was the other one that said to do those. And I was like, I can't, like, I hate it. It's so far out. Like I'm a penguin. Like this is like, just,
Yeah.
it's not practical and it doesn't feel good. I feel like there's a lot of compensation happening and switching to, like we've seen it 1,000 times on your page is like having the dumbbell RDL so close. I mean, like it just creates a better setup for me. And it's something I can consistently load. And I think it is so important to be able to make those kind of decisions based on your structure. Yes, what not necessarily what you're feeling in terms of sensation, but what you can consistently show up for. And like, I don't know, 45 degree is such a hit or miss for me. Like Jordan's been like, hey, like, we can use this initially at the beginning of our workout. But the thing is like the way my femurs to torso are set up and the shitty one we have at our gym, I'm like, I just get so mad doing it because like my torso just runs into the metal plate. And like if I had a client tell me that, I'd be like, we're not doing this then. Like it's out. Like we can find a better setup for this or a different movement to substitute. So I love um I love the autonomy that like you're encouraging. And I'll say the one movement that I want to go back to is the contralateral split squats. Because I don't know about you, but I see just a plethora of people categorizing different types of split squats as quad biased, glute biased, different loading patterns as, you can yield this result. And seeing it on Instagram, it drives me crazy because it's just so far off from what actually is confirmed, what makes sense. I guess walk the listeners through contralaterally loading any kind of split squat, whether rear foot elevated or front foot.
Yeah. So when we use a contralateral load, and for people who that's a big word, okay, it's when you're holding the weight in the arm opposite of the front leg. When we're doing a split squat or a V stance RDL, the front leg is supposed to be the working leg. So if I'm working my right leg, I'm holding a dumbbell or a kettlebell or something in my left side. Now, when we are working with free weights, as opposed to using a barbell or a Smith machine or something. When we have dumbbells, we have the freedom to access more internal rotation at the hip. This is key for glute training because when we take our hip through a larger range of motion there, again, about stretching the glutes around the pelvis, as well as getting more range of motion for the glute medius. So we want to use that contralateral load because it will encourage our body to get into a better position to do so. Oftentimes, when we have a bilateral load, so holding with two dumbbells, we're very square, which is not bad at all. And that's better for more total load. But if we are trying to improve range of motion at the hip, especially, we can take advantage of that contralateral load to actually encourage your body to kind of rotate a little bit towards that front working leg. And Cory and I are similar, and we are both narrow ISA individuals. So I don't want to get into that. It's a whole infrasternal angle, but narrow rib cage, we're naturally biased to be shit at internal rotation. So for people like us and a lot of bikini competitors and women who compete, they fall into this category as well. We're very external rotation bias. The hip is always trying to turn out. The glutes want to be concentric. So by utilizing this contralateral load, we can coax our body away from what we're so used to gravitating towards and put us into a better position, not only during that exercise, but over time that can improve function at the hip to help us on our bilateral movements as well.
I do think that this is a point of contention for a lot of people because they in our space are often told, or I guess maybe not often told. I'm sure they are told that's why they're doing it. But the ipsilateral load is so popular to train the glutes, and it makes me want to rage when I see it, when I see bikini competitors doing an ipsilateral loaded B stance, but also that's the same competitor that's like, I'm trying not to work my adductor, or I'm trying to really focus on, just exclusively working the glute. And in reality, I think applying these kind of loading patterns, like if the trainer or the prescriber, whoever is telling you to do this, if they don't understand realistically the point of having a dumbbell on the outside or the inside of that working leg, then you oftentimes run into a program where you're like, well, I'm not seeing the progress that I was hoping for. I'm not seeing that extra glute need development that, we discussed. And I think it really can be broken down into having intention behind these loading patterns. And in the case we are bilaterally loading, okay, is this one that we can consistently encourage the client to load up heavy? Like, are they lifting a heavy enough load where it's warranted to be bilateral? Because it's the same issue with the split squats. It's like there's a certain point where, I mean, what are you pulling, 70, 80? Like, I mean, like I've seen you do some heavy weight on the split squats, and it's like there's a point where it just becomes so bulky and just very impractical. And that's where I think like some of these other movements, I mean, they can be very complementary, but even going back to like even selecting the order in which you're plugging these movements in, I I think that's another area that people get lost in, and they tend to think, okay, well, let me pre-activate the glute, let me turn it on, let me feel it, let me feel good about this workout, and then I'll start working out. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I am not a fan of doing that kind of like activation in the sense of using bands and kickbacks and like you said, kind of like feeling the glute because I think a lot of people when you squeeze your butt, I think a lot of people can feel it, right? What most people struggle with is actually understanding what it feels like to stretch your glute under load in all these exercises that we keep talking about, right? The lunges, the leg presses, the hinges, all this stuff. So rather than pump it up, I actually prefer to get somebody started by some sort of unilateral exercise. I love a walking lunge. I will just say what I typically run for most of my clients is a hip airplane, which is not loaded. We're just, and people learning that is a whole learning curve in itself. But a hip airplane, actually getting the individual to understand how to internally and externally rotate from that standing hip. And then kind of a progression of that hip airplane is a walking lunge, and actually being able to rotate into your stance leg. And from there, as far as the actual session, it's always going to depend on the person, what their body really needs. But people often think of these single leg movements as an afterthought. They'll do their hip thrusts, they'll do their RDLs, they'll do their kickbacks. And then, like, maybe at the end, and men are totally guilty of this too. Like, oh, let's do like a finisher, like Bulgarian split squats as a finisher. And I'm like, why? Like, why wouldn't we actually give some real credence to these unilateral exercises? Because they can do so much more than just give you a hypertrophy stimulus. It's, again, going back to that function at the hip that we spoke about with the contralateral loading. Any type of unilateral exercise in which you are using dumbbells or free weights in some nature gives you the ability and the skill to have better function at the hip. You learn how to rotate and how to fully, lengthen, stretch the glutes without compromising through your lower spine. I think a lot of people, especially with women's posing, we pose in this crazy anterior pelvic tilt. We're twisting so hard in those side front-ish poses that when it comes to glute training, you got to do the exact opposite. And I think that's where a lot of people also kind of get mixed up, because they're always defaulting to this like really arched lower spine and not really maximizing that stretched glute position that we want.
I think this is where, if someone's lucky, they're stuck in symmetry, where their hips are both glutes are rotated forward. But I think oftentimes, like what you described, you have one hip that is a little more prone to be stuck in internal rotation, one that likes to be a little more in flexion, one that likes to be a little more in extension. And I think this is where we see a lot of imbalances, especially with, I wouldn't even say just specifically seasoned competitors, but you see at the hips this predisposition. And this is really where I think like Jordan and I were able to uncover some of the asymmetry there at the hip. Like, one side really hates internal rotation. The other side, very comfortable in internal rotation, but not very stable. Not like comfortable in the sense that's how I work. So just very used to it. And being able to kind of use B stance RDLs, even if the intention isn't loadability that day, using them to prime bilateral movements and getting a sense of, okay, like what is the hip stability like today? Which side am I struggling more with? I think it can be really telling. And especially if we're talking about symmetry and in glute and tie-in development specifically, I think it's so important for those athletes that, I mean, like, I don't pose my right side whatsoever. Like it looks completely different than my left side. Like it's a completely different physique. It's very thick, very like Ninja Turtle shell. And like realistically, that's probably why there is less, or that probably plays a role just in the exposure that one side gets versus the other. But that's something like I've made a point to at least be aware of in training, that like, hey, that tendency and that, ability to pose really hard on one side and to be in these like contorted positions, we have to undo that at some point. And even if we're going to do bilateral movements and we're going to be on both feet, it's like we still want to have a good gauge of like, okay, what is hip function like today? And if we're doing good maintenance on it, I mean, like theoretically, we should be able to see improvements here. But I think for a lot of people, they don't see the value in that. They see those as like, okay, well, that's more prehab or that's more PT. If I'm injured, I only need to do those in response and very reactively, not necessarily thinking like, hey, that could very much be the reason you don't get more reps or you're not able to lift more weight on your primary movements that are bilateral.
Yeah, 100%. And very much so, like you mentioned, B stance RDL at the front end of a session. I very often will program for myself and for clients either a B stance RDL or some sort of contralaterally loaded, whatever, split squat, lunge, whatever fits, step up, step down, because by going through, let's say, 2 to 3 sets of that movement with a decently heavy weight, like we're not just putting a 15-pound kettlebell in our hands, we're strong people. So by actually going through that exercise 2, 3 sets, it kind of like greases the groove a little bit. So then when you move on to your heavier loaded bilateral movements, even a hip thrust, your hip is going to go through some degree of internal and external rotation during a hip thrust. And it oftentimes will feel better if you've set it up with some sort of single leg exercise beforehand. So I think one thing that a lot of people can benefit from is stop leaving your single leg stuff to the end and just try it. Try it at the beginning of a session. Like nobody said that you have to be setting PRs on your Bulgarian split squats all the time, but like maybe put them at the beginning and see how that actually impacts the rest of the exercises that follow.
No, I think that that's been a very big staple in my programming for, I mean, gosh, the last year as I've gone through builds into preps and out of preps. But even just being able to use these movements to get a really good read on what condition am I in today, and then what decisions can I make around that accordingly. It's been so helpful. And within that, like, I kind of want to segue into proximity to failure because this is probably for me, like the thing that I would say takes the longest to teach. As objective as like I might want to make it for clients, like I do think there's an aspect that just takes repeatedly getting good at getting close to failure. And I would love to hear like with your take. I know you train like a beast. You train really fucking hard. We've seen finisher sets from you. We've seen what failure looks like with clients. Is that something you too experience? Like, okay, this is going to be a skill in itself.
Absolutely. And even for me, yeah, like I like to think I train hard. People think, but like it's for me, even still a skill that I work at, especially a leg press. I still haven't figured it out. I'm still working on it on how to actually get like 1 or 2 reps shy of failure on the leg press. I just feel like it's a work in progress. But the thing with proximity to failure is psychology does come into play. Some people will hurt themselves if you tell them to go to failure because they're just a little crazy on the inside. So, with that type of person, you need to explain the difference between just completely failing like an idiot versus failing with the same form that you started with. And maybe you put them on a seated hamstring curl machine where they're totally constrained and they can't hurt themselves. And then when they go to do their RDL or their stiff leg deadlift, you say, keep a rep or two in the tank for me, would you? Versus you have a lot of people who are actually the opposite and they're afraid to push themselves. And that's the type of person where if you're working one on one in real life, it's so much easier because you go, give me one more, give me one more. And you let them roll their eyes, but you actually figure it out. A lot of us are doing remote coaching. A lot of people who listen to this probably have a remote coach. You guys do everything through video. So after you've ironed out the kinks in technique and you've established this client has the green light to truly try to go to failure in hopes that they will get close to it, that's when you say, okay, I need you to film your top set for me, please. Or if they have 2 working sets, whatever, and you got to review. And then you can explain, hey, you literally did not even struggle on your final rep, and you actually did 3 sets of 15, which means you were not near failure, right? Because the last couple of reps, as you approach failure, the concentric should start to slow down against your own will. Now, for different exercises, failure might look a little bit different, but if you're approaching failure on a hip thrust, for example, it should be so, so difficult to actually reach the top of that lockout, that hip extension position. And if you're still fully reaching it and there's no fighting back from the weight yet, You're not there yet. And a hip thrust is very safe to fail at. RDLs, if you're not shaking or involuntarily twerking a little bit on that concentric, you're not near failure yet. So it's like, yeah, it's really hard to get there. But that's kind of the point.
And I think like without experiencing that, without knowing where that line is, it's really hard to replicate it. But I am I'm very big on like looking at those final 2 reps and saying like, okay, we should see a decrease in velocity. I don't give a shit if it's 50%, 75%, 100%. True failure of like, hey, we need you to go down on a squat and not be able to come back up. Like I did like a week ago. I failed on front squats with Jordan spotting me. It was so embarrassing. I had to post it. Like that, we don't need to do that. That's not productive. Like that level of failure on a leg press or on even like, yes, on movements that are safer, you can take it there. And there's some movements where you shouldn't take it there. Like it's just not productive. It's not helpful. But being able to establish like, just a blanket RAR of 1 to 2 and just like saying land in the ballpark of like, I want those reps to slow down at some point. And that's kind of the framework I use is if we're supposed to do 12 reps and like oftentimes there is an open end rep range of 10 to 15. I don't really want you to go to 15. I want you to go to 15 if for some reason we undershot the weight. But now we know, hey, if we're still at this weight, let's slow down the tempo. Let's make these like really exaggerated. But there's so many ways, like once you're actually in set and you've done a working set without actually modifying the weight to make things harder. And I think a lot of that can go amiss, can feel intimidating to do. But that's where it's like, okay, lock in. And if you undershot and you realize, wow, I actually got 20 at this weight now that I just continued until I saw that drop off in rep speed, well, then that's your green light for next week, assuming you feel as good as you did before. Let's go up 5-10 pounds. And I think like that grading scale of like, did we see a drop off in rep speed on the concentric? Like, do we see like you really fighting to maintain position? If that's not there, then like to me, that means like these sets, it's not that they're not effective. It's just, it's going to take so much more of them to get the same results. And I'm very big on efficiency because I was doing things for a long time. And I remember like doing so many, like I would do 10 sets of abductions and I'm like, I don't know why my glute meads won't grow. I wasn't loading them correctly. I wasn't loading them in a meaningful way. And that's really like kind of the inception of like, let's pick a movement that loads the glute med significantly. For me, that very much comes down to a contralateral loaded split squat or an RDL. And I can say like to be able to replace like how much volume I was doing off isolation movements or like an abduction or even like a glute med biased cable kickback, that feels so good to know like, hey, the answer wasn't 10 sets or 20 sets or a massive reverse pyramid drop set or something of that nature. It was just like, hey, you just weren't training as hard as you need to in order to see that kind of stimulus.
Yeah. And like I said initially, it's a psychology thing. Like you have to, it sounds so dramatic. And I know people, oh, I'm going to war when I go to the gym. Like, no, okay, we're not. But you have to go there, like, especially if it's a heavily loaded exercise where you have to produce a lot of force against that weight. Like, you got to be mentally prepared to go there. But also, when you have a mindset of doing less total sets and having a high quality, I find it easier to go there because I'm like, well, I only got to do it once. Right. Or like, if I get it the right way, I do 2 working sets. Versus if you're like kind of half-assing it and you're doing like, the high volume 5 sets. No, thank you. I love being in the gym, but like 5 sets. No.
I just go crazy. And this is very much like the battle I struggle with like kickbacks because there is a constraint there. And I want this to be a movement that, has a high return, but compared to doing a top set at RDLs at 10 or 12, I'm like doing squats for 5s or 8s. It's like, this is just going to take a lot longer to get the same return, to feel that bad. And I almost like equate it, like if I'm doing a set of 12, it's like the first three are going to be the most comfortable, but it's going to be a vast drop off from 4, 5, 6. And by 6, I'm like regretting that decision to pick up that weight. I'm like, why did you do this? Like, this is going to suck so bad. And I almost walk clients through. I'm like, if you're able to let your thoughts drift, like that last half of the set, if you're not locked in on like, keep your ribs down, stay in position, keep full foot pressure, probably wasn't heavy enough. You're probably not even remotely close to like where I want you to be, especially for a movement that requires so much technique, which like with the movement that's heavily loaded, it's like I want you to maintain that. Like I don't want you to get sloppy with it. It's still it doesn't really count if like we muscled our way there. And that's where like the idea with bodybuilding is like, chase the pump, chase the burn. It's like you can create a lot of sensation through force and like metaphorical muscling it and like just doing high volume, but how effective is that time, is that effort?
Yeah, well, and, it's whether it's bodybuilding or like any sort of niche in working out, there's like the pump, the burn, the all these different things that people say that they feel, and that makes them think they're getting a better workout. But we have a lot of evidence to point to the fact that mechanical tension is ultimately going to be what drives hypertrophy. So, and it's just like I said at the beginning, if you like it, I love it. If you want to do those like Smith machine reverse froggy things that I don't even like, no, we're not going there. But if you want to do them, wonderful. But like, get your good hard work done first. Your more heavily loadable exercises that you can reliably send a lot of stimulus to the target muscle tissue. You mentioned cable kickbacks. I love them. They feel good. You feel your butt when you do a cable kickback, but realistically, like your standing leg, if you're doing a typical standing leg, that leg gets tired after a while. And like trying to lock in on like brace yourself on that cable thing. And then you got to do both legs. And now you spent 15 minutes. And like, what did you really accomplish? Like I said, so yeah, it's just kind of about understanding how to be practical. And again, like removing your emotions and like, oh, but I love that exercise. It's like, okay, but is the rest of your training doing what it really needs to do? And then you can use that little silly movement that you really like to finish things off if you still want to.
It's kind of, I almost like kind of what's coming up is like, it's the dessert. It's like, yeah, like add it in and enjoy it. And if it makes you feel good and you feel like that is the cherry on top, great. If that's how you want to finish the workout, but like make sure you have your meat and potatoes. Make sure like going into kickbacks, you're like, I don't have a lot of bandwidth to do much more than kickbacks. And I had this girl on Patreon ask recently, she's like, hey, my split's a little wild. Like I'm doing split squats 3 times a week and I really don't have much to give after those 6 sets. She's like, I do kickbacks and abductions. She's like, is there a problem with this? She's like, they're very glute focused. I see it confirmed in my measurements. Like I'm building glutes and I'm loading these up for sets of 8. But like afterwards, like I'm so messed up from this. Like that's the only the only big movement I'm doing. And I'm like, honestly, like that I could very much see being more effective than you doing 10 exercises that realistically don't take you to that same proximity to failure, don't work the muscle in the same method. But honestly, yeah, use the isolation work as needed. And I kind of, that's what I strive for is when I get to the end of the workout, like, yeah, I can do abductions and this isn't going to result in the same sensation if I hadn't started my workout with RDLs. It's going to feel much more dulled, which I think a lot of people on the sensation front, they just get really hung up on sensation indicates it's working versus a lack of sensation indicate it isn't. And I was this person for a long time where I very much was like, well, I don't feel like I should finish the set because the pump's gone or I can't feel my glute working. So what is working? And it's like at a certain point, you got to look at like you're doing a hinge. Like, sure, other muscles might be coming into play, but there's no way your glutes aren't working. There's no way you're doing this movement correctly and you're not loading your glutes.
Yeah, and just to kind of like bring things full circle too, now that bikini and wellness, especially like the whole leg needs to have muscle. So I think fit model might be different. I can't speak for that yet, but at least for bikini competitors and wellness competitors, if you're doing a compound movement and you still want it to be mostly glute bias, right? If you're on the leg press, you're doing a hinge, you're doing a split squat, it's okay to feel your quads and or your hamstrings contributing. Like that doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. And for these divisions, like we need meat on the legs in order to get the right shape on stage anyway. So that was a big one for me, is like letting the quads just do their job. Instead of like turning every split squat into like a quasi hinge, which I did for a while. And now I'm like, wasted time, but just kind of like letting the quads do their thing, because it allows you to eke out those extra 2 or 3 more reps for your glutes.
And I very much look at it like, okay, so even if we're getting a little bit of quad activation, because realistically, like I don't have developed quads. Like they're growing for the first time in many, many years. And that is why I feel them so much on certain movements, is like they're very untrained, which is that would be exactly the case if I started doing biceps for the first time for someone who doesn't train biceps or triceps. They're going to feel like shit for a little bit. And then maybe I'm going to start to get a pump after what seems like very little weight and very little volume. And I feel like the same very much applies for the bikini competitor who hasn't trained their quads or hamstrings for a long time, like hasn't done direct heavy work. It's like, well, yeah, they're weak. They're coming into play. They're getting recruited secondarily, tertiarily, because your glutes are fatigued, and your glutes, you're probably not feeling them because at this point, like they can tolerate so much volume before you get that same sensation. And I think being able to remove your, I don't know, your enjoyment, specifically, like, yes, sorry, let me say that better. Being able to detach sensation from how much you enjoy a workout or a session, I think can be really freeing. And I speak with so many women who are just very hung up on like, well, I don't know if it's okay that I'm not feeling these things. And there are coaches who very much emphasize if you're not feeling it, it's not working. And it's just, it's just such a shame. It's so frustrating. But you brought up something at the end there, turning our squat patterns into hinge patterns. Let's fucking go, because this kills me. Like this drives me insane.
Yeah, a squat is a squat, a hinge is a hinge. We can make minor adjustments. For example, if you want to be a little bit more glute focused, sure, hinge your torso forward a little bit. But like ultimately in a split squat or a lunge, you need to bend your knees. And if you lean forward so much, you're going to rob yourself of the ability to stabilize your pelvis. So when you're completely like shifting your upper body forward, you're going to get this like weird anterior pelvic tilt happening. And now your split squat almost looks like a B stance RDL, but it's not as good as a B stance RDL because you're not even stable. You're changing these joint positions from start to finish. So it's like if you're doing a split squat, just do it. Just do it. Don't let your knee completely go all the way past your toes. Don't use a super upright torso if you don't want your quads to be doing the bulk of the work. Just do a split squat or a lunge and understand that your quads have to work if you want to bend and straighten your knee.
And they won't grow nearly as much as your glutes if you're loading them heavily. The center of mass is the thing that gets me with the split squats, is like making it so hingy that the two things that I've heard that like just made my jaw drop is like, hey, am I supposed to be touching my back knee underneath the bench? Or am I supposed to be touching my butt to the bench when I come back to make this glute biased? And I'm like, no,
Neither.
no, we're not supposed to
Why are
do
we thinking
either.
about the back knee that much?
Please avoid thinking about your back leg in entirety. Like just, and that's like, I think we're at American Barbell. We're at the commercial gym we train at, and really shitty bench. And I had the back foot up, switched to rear foot elevated, and the bench broke while I was doing split squats. And like, I definitely felt it, like the pad slipped back horizontally,
Oh my God.
but I didn't like actually like fall. Like nothing happened because so little weight was actually on the back foot. And it like clicked for me. I was like, oh shit, like we really need like so much of it in the front foot. And that's the other aspect that I think with B stance, with unilateral work, it's like, I see it with a lot of clients, I'm sure you do too, is like this desire to escape the position in every way. And then once we correct that, okay, new route in which we can escape this. And I think that's where like everything that we've covered, like internal rotation into that hip, if you understand why we're we're getting into this position, and really just the position you're supposed to be in, it becomes obvious when you can start to see in your own physique, in your own videos, like, oh, this is my compensation. This is because it's hard when I have to stay internally rotated. It doesn't feel good at this weight. So I'm starting to notice I open up a little bit more. And I think that's where, gosh, I think it was like the first coach I had to help me with training was like a really good coach. But like, I remember asking them, like, with split squats, I'm like, which leg am I working? Like, I kid you not. And they're like, oh, you're working both. Squeeze the back glute as you come up, get into extension, but also work the front one at the same time. And I remember just being so baffled by this. I'm like, it's a unilateral movement. We're in a staggered stance. Like, why would just help me make this make sense? And I don't know. I think that's one with split squats. I'm sure you've seen too, just like online today, there's so much confusion around it. So, I mean, like, just, hat off to you on like, hey, keep it a squat. Don't try to make a squat a shitty hinge and also make it a shitty squat at the same time. Um, okay, I want to segue this into when we're talking about some of these movements, like a hip thrust, because I know you said you have a specific machine you really like using at your gym. I guess, what are the constraints you see with the clients who maybe don't have access to a machine, hip thrust, or a glute builder or a Nautilus, who, maybe are working with like a Smith machine setup or barbell setup?
So everything can work, right? If we're thinking about logistics, how much are you willing to actually drag a bench around the gym and whatever, do what you need to do? Do you have a Smith machine that goes all the way to the ground? Can you do this without everybody in your gym hating you? If the answer to those questions are no, then guess what? You can still build really great glutes without it. But Smith machine can be great. With a hip thrust, we want to make sure that the platform or the bench in which your upper back is supported by is low enough so that at the top of your hip thrust, your ribs and your pelvis and your knees can make a nice straight line. When we have a lot of these standard gym benches that are anywhere from like 16 to 20 inches in height, at the top, you're not actually able to like fully extend your hips. And in a hip thrust, that's kind of the whole point. So if you can't make that happen, and then frankly, I find it very annoying to put bumper plates under your feet. I know that's the fix. I've helped client. I think it's annoying, or like an aerobic step or something like that. But you can make the setup work if you have an appropriate height for your back to rest on, making sure that you're actually supporting like your whole back and not just like under your neck. Cause some people like have their whole, only their neck will be supported. And I'm like, what are you doing? And then making sure that you have either Smith machine or a barbell that has enough space around it. So you don't have to like, be in everybody's way just so you can do your hip thrusts. Smith machine has to go all the way to the ground. Otherwise you're not going to get meaningful range of motion on that hip thrust. But and a barbell will obviously require a little bit more overall stability. The beauty of a Smith machine or all these hip thrust machines that have been developed is you don't really have to do a whole lot of stabilizing with your upper body to like lock that barbell in place, right? But if you take the time to really hone in on your given setup, you can make all of them work. A barbell hip thrust can be great if you take the time to actually get good at it.
I think that that's a really important aspect, is really the practicality with exercise selection. And I think a lot of people, they do get hung up on like, well, this is what's written on my program. So if I can't do this, I get frustrated or I feel like it's not as optimal. And I think it's so important for athletes to be able to make that executive decision. I love when athletes come back and they're like, hey, I didn't do this because like realistically, I would have been waiting way too long for this machine. So I made this swap. Here's why I put it here. Let me know if in the future, if I should have made a different swap. Like, let's get that real time feedback. And I think a big part of that comes from confidence that like, hey, I don't need this to be perfect, but like largely everything in the session should be meaningful and should have intent. And even if it's not perfect, it's like, that's why you have a coach like yourself or like myself, where we can kind of guide you and be like, hey, like, this is how I would do it in the future. Or yeah, you nailed it. Like, I think that's a great substitution in the case that you're in this situation, which I know traveling is another big thing that a lot of people, they get, they just get stressed out about. They're like, oh, how can I not lose all the muscle? How can I, not lose progress? And for me, I'm like realistically, like coming back from a longer vacation, like first few sessions, you're probably not going to lift what you were lifting before. And that's okay. Like, that's fine. Like, there's been a lot of changes, and like, we should expect a little bit of recovery that's needed, even if you were on top of everything while you're away. But even within that, I think there's a lot of adaptability. But it does take, I think, knowing just like generally overall function and understanding like why certain movements were selected and why they were organized in the way that your coach has given them to you.
Yeah. And again, like the hip thrust, I feel I can't say it enough. Like you can still have a great glute training program without hip thrusts. Now, do I think if you have access to a good setup, should you probably use it? If you're a bikini competitor, a wellness competitor, and you need glutes, I think more than often, yes. But I know you made a ton of progress in your build with no hip thrusting. So like it very much so can be done.
I yeah, it's one of those things. I think what I'm learning now is that like it really does come down to the athlete's ability to generate adaptation through these other movements. And for me, I mean, like, like in my last apartment, like I had a Nautilus in my apartment, and like I was hip thrusting 3 days a week, hip thrusting a fuck ton of weight. And like my glutes grew, but like they didn't grow to the extent that I wanted them to grow. And seeing the changes that I was able to make with, I mean, a very, I would say redundant, but it's not very redundant, but just a very specified training program that largely just included RDL, split squats, leg press, and then kickbacks and abductions. I mean, like that to me, I was like, yeah, like I'm satisfied with this progress. And if adding hip thrust, if that will enhance anything, amazing. But realistically, yeah, I just know, like, I don't know what I was able to see in my own physique was like training in that state. I was able to get a lot done without it, and that was very much a surprise to myself. Having it back in, I have it in on my like leg C, my Wednesday day. And that's very much like, okay, we're going to get adequate volume, but I follow it up with a leg press, and like leg press that day is like very much sent. Hip thrust, I think I'm still very much guarded in the sense I don't want to get in the habit of just continuing to load up weight if I'm not able to stabilize. And I very much feel like it's just so hard to stabilize correctly, even on a Smith machine. So mentally, I think it's bigger block for me at this point is like I've just gone so long without doing it consistently, or at really heavy weights that I'm like, well, I'll use it to supplement, but I think I'm going to stick with like the primary movements, like being ones that I can load effectively and that I can consistently stabilize with.
Yeah. Well, again, it comes back to exercises that you are proficient at and self confidence in that exercise. You know, some people are really shitty hip thrusters and maybe they need a little bit more practice. Maybe that exercise is going to be lower load, higher rep for them in order to just kind of build up the practice without having to load it as heavily. And the hip thrusting device that you have, I have this amazing machine. This is the first time in my life, like I'm actually hip thrusting like pretty heavy, but the form is like so dialed in. And therefore, yes, it's in my program, but I don't do it every day. Like I don't do it
Yep.
every leg training. It's just that, yeah, like I have three lower body training days, and it's present on two of them. You know?
Yeah, I think it has to make sense for the individual. And like largely when I hear someone struggling to find like their footing with a certain movement, which like B stance RDLs is probably the one that I would say like most people struggle with executing because it just is a very technical movement. And I think the idea is that like they want to load it up heavy because it doesn't seem like it should be that hard. But that's where it can be really very much like a skill builder and really telegraphing to like, okay, where are the bottlenecks in how this person's moving. And that's where like so many of my clients, I'm like, even if we're switching to a landmine, like that is going to give us a little more external support, but realistically, it's still going to allow us to focus on hip stability, pelvic stability, which I don't know, just like finding the value in that in my own progressions. Like it feels good to be able to teach that and like encourage that with clients that like, hey, like you can really find like all your decisions are within a few questions early on in your workout. And then from there, it does become pretty simple. It doesn't have to be as overwhelming or flashy as you might uh, think it has to be based on our online climate.
Yeah, and I think you're a fantastic example that your waist won't get big from doing all of these things because Lord knows so many women, and especially in the sphere of competing, where like basically your waist can never be small enough, right? Like we all want the tiniest waist. Your waist is not going to get bigger because you improve the function of your core by doing like these contralateral movements or even by doing core exercises. Like doing some actual abdominal work, some side planking. Your waist is not going to get bigger.
You you would have to do so much volume to grow your waist through isometrics. Like just like even just thinking about like how much volume, like if you're talking about an isometric, like if you were just doing air kickbacks. I mean, if you were contracting the muscle, making it short, it's like how much volume would it take for you to actually put a quarter of an inch on? And I think a lot of people I've heard a client tell me, I asked her, I was like, why are you wearing a waist trainer in your session? She's like, I'm trying to disengage myself at the waist so it's just my lower body working, and like she's genuine about it. And I was like, okay, cool, here's what we need to focus on. And I think having a coach that can explain this to you and be like, no, 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 like this will always be a bottleneck. Even if you figure out a way to muscle this weight up, eventually it's going to catch up to you, and it's always going to be this that impedes your ability to lift heavier and build more muscle. So for me, that was enough buy-in. It was like, we don't have to grow your waist, but we do have to get your core stronger. And we have to be really cognizant about the state your psoas is in. So that means that daily hygiene and being really clear on like, if you're working a lot of the day, if you're in that position that is going to make it hard for you to maintain that position once in session, then it's going to require a little bit of extra love on the front end of the workout. But thank you so much for that. It's very sweet. I very much, very much am a fan of not having to be constrained to a corset or a waist trainer. I did the corsets, like Adam's corsets. I did them, and like I mean, realistically, if they worked, I'd probably still wear them. But like for a long time, I didn't do them, and my waist didn't grow, and I got leaner the next prep. So I was like, well, okay, this seems null at this point. So yeah, I strongly encourage people who are very set on weightlifting belts or waist trainers just to really define like what's the intention here, and understand like the impact it could be having on your actual sessions themselves.
Yeah, and ultimately the size of your waist, whether it's tapered or not, is dependent on your rib cage. So you can't change your bone structure. Lots of girls who actually naturally have a wider rib cage presentation, they look snatched on stage because of posing and being lean enough. Like it is not worth compromising your ability to train your lower body just by thinking, oh, but maybe I could take a quarter inch off my waist or something like that. Like, good luck progressing your lower body training meaningfully when you're essentially trying to atrophy your core musculature.
And I know I saw there's a pro competitor who's like on a heater right now. She was posting about LPF and how historically she wore her waist trainer like 24 hours a day, and she actually developed an ulcer from it. I'm blanking on her name, but I was that needs to be like plastered. That needs to be like a sponsored ad, because realistically, I do think that there's a lot of individuals who are impressionable and are like, well, this is what a lot of girls are doing. And like, keep in mind, listeners, it's like these girls are sponsored. A lot of them are getting a salary for promoting this, and they have requirements, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it might not apply to you. Like this might not be actually the entire story as to why their waist is as small as it is. So Liz, this has been great. I would love to funnel some people to your page, to your content, to your services. Where can people find you?
Okay, love it. Likewise. Thank you so much for having me on here to chat. So, I am Liz Brody Fitness. So, Liz, Liz, Brody, Brody, Fitness. I hope you guys all know how to spell that. Fitness on Instagram. That's really where you can find me. I do have a little broadcast channel on there, which is like, you just join it and it's free. And I apparently spam your inbox with all that shit. But I'm always posting on my stories. I try my best to post reels, like content regularly. And it's not a high production. I'm not an influencer. I just post things really for my clients and hopefully for people who follow me, that would be directly applicable to their own training because I'm a coach and I'm a trainer first and foremost. My own little bodybuilding endeavors, that's just my life. That's my own thing. But yeah, so you can find me there and I work with all types of people. I work with competitors who have coaches but actually need more training guidance. I work with moms, dads, grandmas. Like I basically do it all. Um, so yeah, Liz Brody Fitness on Instagram.
You guys, I definitely recommend taking a look. If you're someone, and I love that interdisciplinary approach where it's like, if you already have a coach, you're happy with your coach, but you're like, hey, they don't really do the training thing, or I want something a little more hands-on than just a training split and being told to train to failure. Definitely go check Liz out. Her content's amazing. She puts out a ton of free content. You can learn a lot from it. So you guys, hope you like this. Thank you for listening. As always, we'll see you in the next one.